I'm Samantha, 29, the artistic underachiever in a family where my sister Natalie always shined brighter. When her promotion party invitation arrived, I hoped it might finally be our chance to heal old wounds. Instead, with champagne glasses raised and corporate executives watching, she transformed her moment of triumph into my public humiliation. Someone had to play the failure, she smirked, silencing the room. But then her boss stepped forward, microphone in hand, and what happened next changed everything between us. If you're watching this from your own family battlefield, hit like and subscribe, then let me know in the comments if you've ever been publicly humiliated by a sibling. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. Growing up with Natalie was like existing in the shadow of a supernova. From our earliest memories, our differences were not just noticed, but meticulously cataloged and compared by our parents, Eleanor and Richard Thompson. While Natalie excelled academically without seeming effort, I struggled through standardized tests and structured learning environments. My brain simply worked differently. Where she produced perfect test scores and analytical papers, I created art that our teachers praised but my parents dismissed as just doodles. This pattern established itself early and only deepened with time. I vividly remember my 10th birthday when I proudly displayed a painting I'd worked on for weeks. My father glanced at it briefly before turning his attention to Natalie's perfect math test pinned to the refrigerator. Now this, he said, tapping the red A+ circled at the top, this is something that will take you places. My mother nodded in agreement, adding, Samantha, honey, maybe if you focus like your sister, you wouldn't be struggling in algebra. These moments accumulated like tiny cuts, barely noticeable individually but collectively debilitating. By high school, our roles were firmly established. Natalie was class president, valedictorian, and headed to Princeton on a partial scholarship. I was the girl with creative promise who wasn't living up to her potential, according to every parent-teacher conference. At Natalie's high school graduation dinner, my father raised his glass in a toast to my daughter who never disappoints. The words weren't directed at me, but their meaning couldn't have been clearer. Even when I managed small victories, they were diminished by comparison. When I won a regional art competition in my senior year, my mother's response was, "That's nice, dear. Did you know Natalie just got an internship at Anderson Marketing?" These dynamics didn't improve with adulthood. If anything, the gap widened as Natalie's conventional success became more visible. Now at 29, I was scraping by as a freelance graphic designer. My apartment was a small one-bedroom in a neighborhood that my mother referred to as transitional, her polite word for not quite gentrified enough. The past month had been particularly challenging after losing Horizon Coffee, my biggest client, when they decided to take their design work in-house. I was behind on rent and surviving on ramen and the occasional free meal when my boyfriend Jason could afford to treat. Jason was my rock, a kindergarten teacher who understood what it meant to choose passion over paycheck. He believed in my art in a way my family never had, encouraging me to pursue the more experimental design work that actually fulfilled me rather than just chasing commercial clients. Meanwhile, Natalie had followed a perfectly plotted trajectory from Princeton to an MBA, then straight into the corporate marketing world. At 32, she was already a senior account executive at Brenner and Stone, one of the top marketing firms in the city. She drove a BMW, lived in a downtown condo with gleaming hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, and dated Ethan, a corporate attorney whose family had connections to everyone who mattered. Our most recent family gathering had been Thanksgiving 4 months ago, a tense affair that culminated in Natalie questioning my career choices over pumpkin pie. "Still doing those little website designs?" she'd asked, in that tone that managed to sound both concerned and condescending simultaneously. "You know, we have an entry-level position in our graphics department." I could put in a word. When I explained that I preferred the creative freedom of freelancing, my mother jumped in. "Freedom doesn't pay the bills, Samantha. Maybe it's time to consider something more stable like your sister did." My father nodded sagely, adding, "Natalie was making six figures by your age." I'd left early that night, with Jason squeezing my hand supportively as I fought back tears in the car. Despite these dynamics, I still tried to maintain some relationship with my sister. I dutifully sent birthday cards, congratulatory texts for her achievements, and occasionally suggested meeting for coffee, invitations that were usually met with "so busy right now, maybe next month." I told myself it was just her hectic schedule, not a deliberate avoidance of spending time with her less successful sister. I wanted to believe that somewhere underneath the competition and comparison, there might still be a foundation of sisterly love. And honestly, a small part of me still yearned for her approval, as if winning over my harshest critic might finally validate my choices. The invitation to Natalie's promotion party arrived on a Tuesday, an expensive cream-colored card with embossed gold lettering announcing her elevation to Vice President of Client Relations at Brenner and Stone. I stood in my cramped kitchen, reading and rereading the formal text while my ancient refrigerator hummed loudly in the background, a fitting soundtrack to the contrast between our lives. My first instinct was to decline. The thought of spending an evening watching Natalie bask in adoration while fielding pitying looks and uncomfortable questions about my own career made my stomach clench. When Jason came over that evening, I showed him the invitation. "Are you going to go?" he asked, settling beside me on my second-hand couch. I sighed, running my finger over the raised lettering. "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should, to be supportive. But these things always end up making me feel terrible about myself." Jason considered this, his kind eyes studying my face. "What if this could be different? Maybe seeing you support her success might help bridge that gap between you. Or maybe she just invited me because our parents would notice if she didn't," I countered. "Sam," Jason said gently, "you're always saying you wish things were better between you two. Maybe this is an opportunity." His optimism was one of the things I loved most about him, even when it felt naive. After a long discussion weighing the potential for reconnection against the almost certain discomfort, I decided to attend. If nothing else, it would show Natalie and my parents that I could be genuinely happy for her success, even if they couldn't return the sentiment for my different path. The decision made, a new problem emerged: what to wear. My wardrobe consisted primarily of comfortable clothes suitable for working from home, with a few meet the client outfits that were nowhere near formal enough for what would undoubtedly be an elegant corporate event. With less than 2 weeks until the party and barely enough in my checking account to cover next month's rent, I called my friend Cassandra in desperation. Cassandra worked at a local boutique and had an uncanny ability to find hidden gems at thrift shops. "We'll find you something that makes your sister's lawyer boyfriend drool and her coworkers wonder why you're not designing for Vogue," she declared confidently. The following Saturday, we embarked on a marathon shopping session through every consignment store and sample sale in a 20-mile radius. By the fifth store, exhaustion was setting in, and I was ready to give up. "Maybe I should just tell her I'm sick," I muttered as we rifled through another rack of discounted dresses. "And miss the chance to show up looking amazing?" "Not happening," Cassandra replied firmly. In the very back of the final store, hanging slightly apart from the other garments, we found it, a midnight blue dress with a subtle shimmer that caught the light as the fabric moved. It was slightly more formal than I'd normally choose, but not ostentatiously so, with clean lines that complemented my figure. Best of all, it had been drastically reduced because of a small flaw in the stitching that Cassandra assured me she could easily fix. As I tried it on, emerging from the dressing room to Cassandra's enthusiastic approval, a small spark of confidence ignited. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I could walk into Natalie's world for one night and hold my head high. "Just promise me one thing," Cassandra said as we waited in line to pay. "Don't let her get to you. No matter what she says or how she acts, remember that your worth isn't measured by her standards." I nodded, but we both knew that was easier said than done after a lifetime of exactly that kind of measurement. The day of the party arrived with a mix of spring rain and my own stormy emotions. I spent the morning trying to work on a small design project, but my concentration kept slipping as I mentally rehearsed potential conversations. What would I say when Natalie's colleagues inevitably asked what I did for a living? How would I respond if someone commented on the differences between us? Jason arrived early to provide moral support, looking handsome in the one good suit he owned, usually reserved for parent-teacher conferences and special occasions. "You look beautiful," he said sincerely as I emerged from the bedroom in my carefully selected outfit, hair and makeup done with more attention than I'd given them in months. "Are you ready for this?" I wasn't, not really, but I nodded anyway. As ready as I'll ever be. The drive to the venue took us from my neighborhood of modest apartments and family-owned businesses to the gleaming downtown district where success was measured in square footage and architectural prestige. Brenner and Stone had rented out the top floor of the atrium, one of the city's most exclusive event spaces, known for hosting celebrity weddings and high-profile corporate functions. As we pulled up to the valet stand, I took a deep breath. "Remember," Jason said, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze, "we can leave anytime you want." With that small comfort, I stepped out of the car and toured what I hoped might be a new chapter in my relationship with my sister. The atrium lived up to its reputation. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across polished marble floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city's skyline, now glowing in the early evening light. Well-dressed servers circulated with trays of champagne and artfully arranged hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I accepted a glass of champagne, needing something to occupy my hands and calm my nerves. Jason whispered in my ear, "Remember, you belong here just as much as anyone else." I wasn't convinced, but I appreciated the sentiment. We spotted Natalie holding court near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers in expensive suits and designer dresses. She looked impeccable in a tailored red dress that emphasized her confident posture, her dark hair arranged in an elegant updo that had undoubtedly cost several $100s at a salon. Beside her stood Ethan, tall and conventionally handsome in a way that matched his conventional success. When Natalie finally noticed us approaching, her smile flickered almost imperceptibly before re-establishing itself. "Samantha, you made it," she said, leaning in for an air kiss that carefully avoided actual contact. "And Jason, nice to see you again." Her tone suggested it was anything but. "Congratulations on the promotion," I said genuinely. "You must be really proud." "Well, it was the natural next step," she replied with practiced modesty that somehow still managed to sound like boasting. "Let me introduce you to some people." What followed was a rapid-fire series of introductions to colleagues whose names blurred together, each one regarding me with the same polite curiosity one might show toward an exotic but potentially disappointing exhibit. "This is my sister, Samantha," Natalie would say, never mentioning my profession or accomplishments, as if I existed solely in relation to her. "Samantha does some graphic design work," she finally added when one colleague inquired directly, her tone suggesting a hobby rather than a career. Ethan eventually separated us from the group, perhaps sensing my discomfort or simply wanting to establish his own connection to Natalie's family. "So, Sam, still doing the art thing?" he asked, swirling his whiskey with one manicured hand. "Graphic design," I corrected gently. "Yes, I'm working with several clients on brand development and digital presence." "Sounds creative," he replied, in a tone that suggested creative was synonymous with financially questionable. "It must be nice having such flexibility in your schedule." Before I could respond to the thinly veiled implication that my work wasn't really work, we were interrupted by the arrival of an older man with salt and pepper hair and keen eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Ethan, aren't you going to introduce me?" he asked, his voice carrying authority without aggression. "Of course, Harold. This is Samantha Thompson, Natalie's sister. And her boyfriend, Jason Carter." "Sam, Jason, this is Harold Brenner, the founding partner. One of the Brenners of Brenner and Stone, I realized, feeling suddenly out of my depth. But Harold surprised me with his warm handshake and genuine smile. Natalie mentioned you're a graphic designer, he said, and I was startled that she'd mentioned me at all, let alone my profession. Yes, I work independently with various clients on their visual branding and digital assets, I replied, falling into the elevator pitch I'd practiced. Independent work can be the most fulfilling, Harold remarked. I started this company because I couldn't stand having anyone else dictate my creative vision. Do you have a website? The conversation shifted into surprisingly comfortable territory as Harold asked intelligent questions about my design philosophy and approach. For the first time that evening, I felt seen as a professional rather than just Natalie's less successful sister. I noticed Natalie watching our interaction from across the room, her expression unreadable, but her attention unmistakable. Our conversation was eventually interrupted when Emma, a junior executive I'd been introduced to earlier, joined us. Harold, the A/V team needs you to approve the presentation setup, she said. Harold excused himself, but not before saying, we should continue this discussion later, Samantha. We occasionally need freelance design work when our in-house team is overloaded. As he walked away, Emma lingered. So you're Natalie's artistic sister, she said, her tone friendly, but her eyes assessing. She doesn't talk about you much. We have different lives, I replied diplomatically. Different, she laughed lightly. From what I gather, it's like comparing a rocket ship to a paper airplane. She seemed to realize how this sounded and quickly added, not that there's anything wrong with paper airplanes. They're much more accessible to most people. With that backhanded attempt at recovery, she excused herself to speak with another colleague. Left momentarily alone as Jason went to get us fresh drinks, I overheard snippets of conversation from a nearby group. That's the other Thompson sister, someone murmured. The one who didn't go to Princeton? Another voice replied with subtle emphasis on didn't. I pretended to be absorbed in the view from the windows, fighting the familiar feeling of inadequacy that always seemed to find me at family gatherings, now expanded to include my sister's professional circle. When Jason returned with our drinks, I whispered, I need 5 minutes away from these people. He nodded understandingly, and we found a relatively quiet corner near an elaborate floral arrangement. How are you holding up? He asked. About as well as expected, I admitted. Everyone here measures success in promotions and profit margins. I don't think they'd recognize creative fulfillment if it introduced itself with business cards. Jason squeezed my hand. Their opinion doesn't define you, Sam. Before I could respond, Natalie appeared beside us, momentarily separated from her admirers. There you are, she said, as if we'd been deliberately hiding. The speeches will be starting soon. You should find your seats at table 7. I saw an opportunity for connection and took it. Natalie, I really am happy for you. This is a huge achievement. For a moment, something like genuine emotion flickered across her face. Thanks, she said, and for that brief second, she was just my sister, not my competitor. It's been a lot of work to get here. I'm sure it has, I agreed. Your dedication has always been incredible. She seemed about to say something else when Gabrielle, the marketing director, approached to discuss some last-minute detail about the presentation. Natalie immediately switched back to professional mode, our moment of connection evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. As we made our way to our assigned table, located noticeably far from the central tables where Natalie and the executives would sit, I tried to hold on to that fleeting moment of sisterly recognition. Maybe there was still hope for us after all. As the formal portion of the evening began, the ambient lighting dimmed slightly and a spotlight illuminated a small stage area where a podium had been set up. The company CEO, a polished woman named Victoria Stone, approached the microphone first. Tonight, we celebrate not just a promotion, but a rising star who exemplifies everything Brenner and Stone stands for, she began, launching into a glowing introduction of Natalie's accomplishments. I listened as Victoria detailed my sister's meteoric rise within the company, the major accounts she'd secured, the innovative campaigns she'd spearheaded, the revenue growth she'd generated. With each achievement mentioned, applause rippled through the room, and I found myself clapping along, genuinely impressed by what Natalie had accomplished. Various executives took turns sharing anecdotes about Natalie's dedication and talent. Harold Brenner spoke about her unparalleled work ethic and razor-sharp strategic mind. The praise was effusive, but from what I could tell, sincere. Finally, Victoria called Natalie to the stage, presenting her with an engraved crystal award that caught the light as she accepted it. The room erupted in enthusiastic applause, and I felt a complicated mix of pride and that familiar twinge of inadequacy. As the applause subsided, Natalie adjusted the microphone and surveyed the room with confident poise. "Thank you all so much for this recognition and for being here tonight," she began, her voice warm and assured. "When I joined Brenner and Stone 6 years ago, I knew I'd found my professional home. The mentorship and opportunities I've received here have been extraordinary." She went on to thank specific colleagues for their support, acknowledging her team members and the executive leadership. Her gratitude seemed genuine, and I found myself smiling at this side of my sister I rarely got to see, accomplished, respected, and gracious. "I'd also like to thank my boyfriend, Ethan, for his unwavering support," she continued, gesturing toward him as a smattering of applause broke out. "And of course, my family, my parents, who instilled in me the drive to succeed from an early age. Our parents weren't present, having scheduled a cruise that overlapped with the event, but Natalie acknowledged them anyway." Then she paused, and her gaze found me in the crowd. "And my sister, Samantha, who's here tonight." All eyes in the room shifted momentarily to where Jason and I sat, and I felt a flush creeping up my neck at the sudden attention. "It's interesting how different two people from the same family can be," Natalie continued, a new edge entering her voice. "We took such different paths. While I was pulling all-nighters to finish my MBA, Sam was finding herself through art." The way she said finding herself made it sound frivolous, indulgent. "I sometimes think about nature versus nurture and how we end up where we do in life. The choices we make, the priorities we set." Her smile remained in place, but her eyes had hardened slightly. "I guess in every family dynamic, there are different roles to play. The achiever and—" She paused, her gaze locking with mine. "Well, someone had to play the failure." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the audience, quickly fading into awkward silence. My cheeks burned as I felt dozens of eyes on me, some embarrassed, some curious, some barely concealing their amusement at my public humiliation. Beside me, Jason's hand tightened around mine, his face a mask of controlled anger on my behalf. I sat frozen, unable to process that my sister had just deliberately degraded me in front of a room full of strangers at what should have been her moment of professional triumph. The champagne in my stomach curdled as Natalie continued her speech as if she hadn't just driven a knife into my heart, her voice carrying on about goals and teamwork while I fought to maintain my composure. I wanted nothing more than to flee, to escape the pitying glances now being cast in my direction, but some stubborn part of me refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me run. So I sat there, back straight, face burning, as my sister completed her speech to renewed applause. The success of her career juxtaposed against her failure as a sister had never been more starkly apparent. As she left the podium, I caught the self-satisfied smirk that flickered across her face when our eyes met briefly across the room. In that moment, I understood that this hadn't been an accidental slight or a poorly considered joke. It had been deliberate. She had wanted to establish her superiority over me in front of her colleagues, to ensure that everyone knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of success. The realization felt like ice water in my veins, shocking and clarifying at once. This was who my sister had become, or perhaps who she had always been, just with better manners in place until now. I sat immobilized by hurt and humiliation as the room resumed its casual chatter, the moment already fading for everyone except me. "We should go," Jason whispered, his protective instinct in full force. "I'm not leaving," I whispered back, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I won't give her the satisfaction." Jason nodded, his expression a mix of concern and pride. "Then we stay, and we hold our heads high." I nodded, blinking back tears that threatened to spill over. I would not cry here, not where she could see. The evening stretched before me like an endless gauntlet, but something had shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and throbbing, but beneath it was something else, a slow-burning anger that felt strangely empowering after years of accepting my assigned role as the lesser sister. As the uncomfortable murmurs following Natalie's speech began to subside, I noticed a subtle movement at the head table. Harold Brenner was leaning over to whisper something to Victoria Stone, his expression serious. She nodded, her perfectly maintained professional smile faltering for just a moment. Harold stood and approached the podium, gently tapping the microphone to recapture the room's attention. "If I could just say a few additional words," he began, his authoritative voice immediately quieting the scattered conversations. Natalie, who had been accepting congratulations from colleagues, turned to look at her boss with surprise. She hadn't expected anyone else to speak after her. Harold adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Success is an interesting concept," he began. "In my 40 years in business, I've seen it defined and redefined countless times." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests before briefly resting on me. "When I was about 30, at what I thought was the height of my career, my younger brother was struggling to establish himself as a photographer. Our family, particularly our father, saw his pursuit as impractical, even irresponsible. A subtle tension rippled through the room as people began to realize this wasn't just an afterthought to Natalie's speech. I'm ashamed to admit that I shared that view. I measured success by promotions, by income, by the external validation of peers and superiors." Harold removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully before continuing. "Then my brother got his first gallery showing. I went reluctantly, expecting to see amateurish work that I could politely compliment before returning to my real career." His voice softened with the memory. "Instead, I saw the world through his eyes, beauty, pain, truth captured in ways I'd never considered." It humbled me profoundly. The room was completely silent now, every person present hanging on his words. I realized that night that success isn't a single path or a uniform measure. True success, I've come to believe, is finding the courage to pursue what makes you come alive, regardless of whether it fits conventional definitions. His gaze shifted to Natalie, who was now watching him with a slightly perplexed expression. "Natalie is absolutely deserving of this promotion and recognition. Her work here has been exceptional by every metric we value at Brenner and Stone." He let this affirmation sink in before adding, "But I've always maintained that the most important metric of success is character, how we treat others, especially those who take different paths from our own." The implication of his words was unmistakable. Several people near me shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others darted glances between Harold, Natalie, and me. "I had the pleasure of speaking briefly with Samantha Thompson earlier this evening," Harold continued, catching me by surprise at the mention of my name. "What struck me was her passion for design work that prioritizes authentic expression over mass appeal, something many of our clients could benefit from in this age of generic corporate aesthetics." I felt a rush of unexpected emotion at this public recognition of my professional value from someone of Harold's stature. Different paths, different measures of success, but equally valid and worthy of respect, he concluded, his voice gentle but firm. That's something I hope we all remember, not just in our professional assessments, but in our personal relationships as well. With a final nod that somehow managed to encompass both Natalie and me, Harold stepped away from the podium. The silence that followed was profound, eventually broken by scattered applause that grew in strength. I noticed several people glancing at me with new interest, while others were looking at Natalie with expressions ranging from curiosity to subtle judgment. Natalie herself stood rigid, her smile frozen in place, but her eyes burning with a mixture of confusion and anger. She clearly hadn't expected her moment of triumph to be reframed in this way. As the formal program concluded and people began to mingle again, Harold made his way directly to our table. "Samantha," he said, extending his hand. "I hope I didn't overstep just now." "Not at all," I managed, still processing what had happened. "Thank you for your words." "They were entirely sincere," he assured me. "And actually, I'd like to discuss something with you. We have a new client, a boutique hotel chain looking to differentiate themselves with authentic local art and design elements. Your perspective could be valuable to this project." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. "Call my office next week if you're interested. Ask for Denise. She'll put you straight through." Before I could fully process this unexpected professional opportunity, Natalie materialized at Harold's side, her composure restored, but her eyes flashing with barely contained emotion. "Harold, the Westridge team was hoping to speak with you about their campaign launch," she said pointedly. Harold nodded but didn't immediately move. "We'll talk soon, Samantha," he said, giving me a meaningful look before allowing Natalie to guide him away. As they walked off, I saw Natalie lean in to say something to him, her expression intense. Jason squeezed my hand under the table. "Did that just happen?" he whispered. "I think it did," I replied, staring at the business card in my hand as if it might disappear at any moment. For the next half hour, the dynamic of the evening shifted subtly but significantly. Several of Natalie's colleagues approached our table, introducing themselves more thoroughly and asking genuine questions about my work. Emma, who had earlier made the paper airplane comparison, now seemed eager to discuss a logo redesign her department was considering. Even Ethan made his way over at one point, his attitude notably more respectful as he inquired about current trends in digital design. Throughout it all, I could feel Natalie watching from across the room, her perfect evening taking a turn she hadn't anticipated. For the first time in our adult lives, I wasn't just her less successful sister. I was someone whose different path had been publicly validated by a person she deeply respected. The balance of power had shifted, however slightly, and we both knew it. I was speaking with a creative director from Natalie's firm when I felt a hand grasp my elbow firmly. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Natalie's voice was controlled but tight. "Privately." Without waiting for my response, she guided me toward a small side room off the main event space. Jason caught my eye, silently asking if I needed him to intervene, but I gave a small shake of my head. This confrontation had been brewing for years. It was time to face it directly. The room Natalie led me to appeared to be a small conference room, now serving as a storage area for extra chairs and catering supplies. She closed the door behind us, then turned to face me, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw anger. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, arms crossed defensively across her chest. "What am I doing?" I repeated, genuinely confused. "Standing there while your boss publicly undercut me," she clarified, her voice rising slightly. "Do you have any idea how that looked?" The absurdity of her accusation momentarily stunned me. How it looked? "Natalie, you just called me a failure in front of an entire room of people. Your colleagues. Your boss." I was making a joke, she insisted, though we both knew it had been nothing of the sort. "And somehow you turned it into an opportunity to make me look bad on what should have been my night." "I didn't do anything," I said, my own anger finally breaking through. "Harold made his own observations based on how you chose to treat me." "How you've always treated me." Natalie scoffed. "Oh, please, don't start with the victim routine. You've always been so sensitive about everything." "Sensitive?" You publicly humiliated me, and I'm supposed to just laugh it off. My voice shook with emotion I'd suppressed for too long. You know what, Natalie? I've spent my entire life trying to be happy for you, to support your achievements even while you belittled mine. I've shown up, I've smiled, I've deflected every condescending comment and backhanded compliment. And for what? So you could use your biggest professional moment to put me in my place. Something in my tone must have penetrated her defensive shield because her expression shifted slightly. You act like I've had everything handed to me, she said, her voice lower but still intense. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to get here? Of course I do, I replied. I've watched you climb every step of the corporate ladder. I've never questioned your work ethic or your talent, Natalie. What I don't understand is why my different path threatens you so much that you needed to diminish it publicly. Threatens me. She laughed, but it sounded hollow. Why would I be threatened by someone who can barely make rent? The words stung, but I refused to be derailed. If you're so secure in your choices, why do you constantly need to compare them to mine? Why use your speech tonight to establish your superiority instead of just celebrating your achievement? Natalie turned away slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her arm. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge. You have no idea what it's like to be the one everyone expects to succeed. Do you know how terrified I am of failure? One misstep, and everything I've built could collapse. The admission surprised me. In all our years of rivalry, she had never acknowledged any vulnerability. At least you got to choose your path, she continued unexpectedly. Mom and Dad just assumed I'd follow in their footsteps. College, business school, corporate career. There was never a question. Choose. I repeated incredulously. Natalie, I wanted their approval just as much as you did. The difference is you could get it by doing what they valued, while I was constantly trying to make them see value in something they didn't understand or respect. We stood in silence for a moment, the years of misunderstanding and competition hanging between us. Do you know what I thought when I saw your work in that student showcase senior year? Natalie asked suddenly. The one with the experimental mixed media pieces? I nodded, surprised she even remembered it. I was jealous, she admitted quietly. Not of the art itself, but of how completely yourself you seemed when you were talking about it. I've never felt that kind of, I don't know, alignment between who I am and what I do. The confession left me momentarily speechless. But you're so successful, I finally said. You have everything. The career, the boyfriend, the condo. I have what looks like success, she corrected. Don't get me wrong, I'm good at what I do, and I've earned everything I've achieved. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to pursue something just because it calls to me, not because it's what's expected. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, possibly ever. The artificial roles we'd been assigned, and had eventually assigned ourselves, were momentarily set aside, revealing the complex people beneath. For what it's worth, I said carefully, I've always admired your determination, even when it made me feel inadequate by comparison. Natalie's expression softened slightly, and I've admired your courage to pursue what fulfills you, even without the validation I've always needed. Before we could explore this newfound understanding further, my phone buzzed with a text from our mother. Natalie's phone chimed simultaneously. Mom, we both said in unison, sharing a brief moment of sisterly recognition. The text was inquiring about the event, asking for photos of Natalie's big moment. The intrusion of our parents, even from a distance, seemed to reactivate old patterns. Natalie straightened her posture, professional mask slipping back into place. We should get back out there, she said, though with less hostility than before. People will be wondering where I went. As we moved toward the door, I placed a hand on her arm. Natalie, about what Harold said, the potential project. I won't pursue it if you're uncomfortable with me working with your company. She paused, considering this. It's a good opportunity, she finally said. And frankly, after tonight, turning it down would look worse for me than accepting it would. It wasn't exactly a blessing, but it was something. As we rejoined the party, Our interaction had shifted, not dramatically transformed, but altered in subtle ways that suggested the possibility of change. The next morning, my phone rang with my mother's name displayed on the screen. I hesitated before answering, already anticipating the conversation. "Samantha," she began without preamble. "What happened last night? Natalie sounds upset." I took a deep breath. "Did she tell you what she said during her speech?" "She mentioned there was a misunderstanding," my mother replied vaguely. "But honestly, couldn't you have just been supportive for one night?" This was a big moment for her. The familiar pattern of assumption that any conflict between us must be my fault ignited a new resolve in me. "Mom," I said firmly, "for years I've listened to you and Dad compare us, always finding me wanting. Last night, Natalie called me a failure in front of her entire company. Her boss stepped in because he recognized how inappropriate that was, not because I did anything." There was a startled silence on the other end of the line. "She called you a failure?" my mother finally asked, her tone suggesting she found this hard to believe. Her exact words were, "Someone had to play the failure," I confirmed. And instead of apologizing, she blamed me for her boss's reaction. Another silence, longer this time. "I didn't know," my mother finally said, her voice smaller than I was accustomed to hearing it. "You never asked," I pointed out. "You've always assumed that Natalie's version of events is the correct one." "That's not fair," she protested, but with less conviction than I expected. "Isn't it?" I challenged gently. "When's the last time you asked about my work with genuine interest? Or acknowledged that success might look different for different people?" The question hung between us, uncomfortable but necessary. "I just want you to be secure," she finally said. "To not struggle the way we did when you were young." It was the first time she'd acknowledged that motivation, and it helped me understand her perspective, even if I didn't agree with it. "I appreciate that," I said. "But I need you to understand that I've chosen my path deliberately, not because I couldn't succeed on Natalie's path. And I need you to respect that choice, even if you don't fully understand it." The conversation continued, more honest than our usual exchanges, though not without its difficult moments. By the end, nothing was fully resolved, but something had shifted. My mother promised to reflect on her role in our sibling rivalry, and I promised to be more direct about my feelings rather than letting resentment build. 3 days after the party, I called Harold Brenner's office as suggested. His assistant Denise put me through immediately, as promised. "Samantha," Harold greeted me warmly. "I'm glad you called. Are you interested in discussing the Meridian Hotels project?" "I am," I confirmed. "Though I want to be sure this won't create additional tension with Natalie." "Your sister is a professional," Harold said confidently. "And more importantly, your aesthetic is precisely what this client is looking for. Authentic, distinctive, with a sense of place that their current branding lacks." We discussed the project parameters, timeline, and compensation, which was significantly more generous than I'd anticipated. By the end of the call, I had agreed to develop initial concepts for the hotel chain's rebranding, with the potential for an ongoing relationship if the initial phase was successful. When I hung up, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing this unexpected opportunity. Later that day, I received a text from Natalie. "Harold told me about the Meridian project. It's a good fit for your style." It wasn't exactly effusive support, but coming from Natalie, it felt like a significant olive branch. I replied with a simple, "Thank you. That means a lot." Her response came quickly, "Just don't make me look bad by association." Followed immediately by another text. That was supposed to be a joke. "I'm working on it." And for the first time in years, I found myself smiling at a message from my sister. The 6 months following Natalie's promotion party brought changes I couldn't have anticipated that night when I'd stood humiliated before a room of strangers. The Meridian Hotels project turned out to be exactly the kind of work I'd always wanted: creative freedom within professional parameters, with clients who valued authentic expression over corporate blandness. My concepts for their rebranding were enthusiastically received, leading to a comprehensive contract not just for their visual identity, but for ongoing design work across their properties. The financial stability this provided allowed me to be more selective with my other clients, focusing on projects that aligned with my creative vision rather than simply taking whatever would pay the bills. I was able to move from my cramped apartment to a modest but charming two-bedroom with enough space for a proper home office and studio area. Jason helped me paint and set up the new space, his pride in my success evident in every encouraging word and supportive gesture. "You know what's different about you lately?" he asked one evening as we sat on my new couch, takeout containers spread across the coffee table. "Besides the fact that I can now afford real food instead of ramen?" I joked. "You stand taller," he said seriously. "You always had talent, but now you have confidence to match it." He was right. Something fundamental had shifted in how I viewed myself and my work. The validation from Harold and the subsequent professional opportunities had helped, certainly, but the greater change had come from within, from finally confronting the family dynamics that had shaped my self-perception for so long. 2 months after the party, I started seeing a therapist named Leanne, who specialized in family dynamics and adult sibling relationships. Our weekly sessions helped me unpack years of comparative judgment and internalized messaging about what constituted real success. "What I'm hearing," Leanne observed during one particularly insightful session, "is that you've spent much of your life trying to earn approval using a value system that doesn't align with your own." This simple framing helped me recognize how I'd been setting myself up for failure by trying to succeed on terms that weren't authentic to who I was. With Leanne's guidance, I began establishing healthier boundaries with my family. I declined invitations to gatherings that historically had devolved into comparisons and criticism. When I did see my parents, I gently but firmly redirected conversations that slipped into old patterns. "I notice we're comparing again," became my calm refrain when my father would juxtapose my recent design award with Natalie's quarterly bonus. Sometimes they caught themselves, sometimes they didn't, but I no longer allowed their metrics to define my worth. My relationship with Natalie evolved in fits and starts. The raw honesty of our confrontation at the party had cracked open a door that neither of us seemed quite ready to walk through fully, but neither were we willing to slam it shut again. We began meeting for coffee once a month, awkward at first, then gradually more comfortable as we learned to relate to each other as adults rather than as competing siblings. During our third meetup, Natalie surprised me by asking detailed questions about my creative process for the Meridian project. "I don't think I've ever really understood how you work," she admitted. "In my world, everything is data and strategy and measurable outcomes. And in mine, it's intuition and visual language and emotional response," I replied. "Different languages for different purposes." She nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why we've never really been able to communicate well. We're literally speaking different languages." It was an insight that helped frame our ongoing efforts to understand each other. I learned about the pressures Natalie faced in her high-stakes corporate environment, the constant need to prove herself in male-dominated meetings, the way her perfectionism was both her greatest strength and her heaviest burden. She began to appreciate the courage required to pursue a creative path without the safety net of organizational structure, the discipline needed to maintain a freelance career, the integrity involved in refusing projects that didn't align with my values despite financial temptation. We were building, if not the close sisterly bond depicted in greeting cards, at least a relationship based on mutual respect and authentic understanding. Our parents were slower to adapt. After decades of parenting according to a particular success narrative, they struggled to expand their perspective. But my mother made more effort than I'd expected, occasionally sending me articles about innovative design work or asking specific questions about my current projects. My father remained more distant, though there was a noticeable decrease in his comparative comments. The holiday season brought the ultimate test of our evolving family dynamic, Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' home, with both Natalie and me attending with our respective partners. In previous years, Such gatherings had been minefields of subtle digs and painful comparisons. This time, I arrived with both boundaries and compassion firmly in place. The difference was immediately apparent. My mother had made a point of displaying the framed advertisement featuring my design work for Meridian on the living room wall, alongside Natalie's corporate awards. My father, though still more comfortable discussing Natalie's world, made a visible effort to engage with Jason about his teaching career. When the conversation inevitably turned to work, I shared news of my recent success with a high-profile restaurant chain without diminishing it or waiting for someone else to do so. Natalie spoke of challenges with a difficult client, acknowledging moments of self-doubt that she would never have revealed in the past. After dinner, as we helped clear the table, Natalie leaned over to whisper, "Is it just me, or is this the least stressful family dinner we've ever had?" "Definitely not just you," I confirmed, though I still have a therapy appointment scheduled for tomorrow, just in case. She laughed, a genuine sound without the competitive edge I'd grown accustomed to hearing. "Maybe I should look into that therapy thing too," she said, half joking but with an undertone of sincerity. "It seems to be working for you." Later that evening, as Jason and I drove home, he remarked on the change. "That was almost a normal family gathering," he said with mock astonishment. "Only mild tension instead of seismic." I smiled, watching the familiar streets pass by with new eyes. "We're all learning," I said. Slowly, imperfectly, but learning. The truth was, healing family relationships built on decades of unhealthy patterns couldn't happen overnight. There were still awkward moments, occasional backsliding into old roles, times when a careless word would reactivate old wounds. But there was also growth, increased awareness, and genuine effort from all sides. As for my professional life, the Meridian project led to connections with other clients who valued authentic design over corporate conformity. My portfolio expanded to include work I was genuinely proud of, not just pieces that paid the bills. Harold became something of a mentor, occasionally recommending me for projects that suited my aesthetic and introducing me to contacts throughout the industry. I even collaborated with Natalie on a campaign for one of her smaller clients, a challenging but ultimately rewarding experience that demonstrated how our different perspectives could complement rather than compete with each other. Through it all, I came to understand that success wasn't a finite resource that Natalie and I had to fight over. Her achievements didn't diminish mine. My fulfillment didn't threaten hers. We had both been shaped by a family narrative that pitted us against each other, but we weren't obligated to continue that story into our adult lives. On a crisp spring morning, almost exactly a year after the promotion party incident, I met Natalie for our now regular coffee. She seemed preoccupied, stirring her latte absently while I told her about a new project. "Sorry," she said, catching herself. "I'm listening, I promise. It's just..." She hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Ethan and I broke up last night." "Oh," I said, surprised but not entirely shocked. Their relationship had always seemed more strategic than passionate. "Are you okay?" She considered the question carefully. "Yes and no. It was my decision, but it still feels unsettling. Like I'm deviating from the script." "The script." She nodded. "Perfect career, perfect partner, perfect life. I've been following it so long, I'm not sure who I am without it." It was perhaps the most vulnerable I'd ever seen her. "Maybe that's something worth discovering," I suggested gently. She looked up from her coffee, a mixture of fear and possibility in her expression. "Maybe it is." As we continued talking, I realized how far we'd both come from that night when she'd publicly branded me a failure. We weren't just sisters by birth anymore. We were becoming sisters by choice, slowly building a relationship based on who we actually were rather than the roles we'd been assigned. It wasn't perfect. Nothing real ever is, but it was authentic in a way our previous interactions had never been. And in that authenticity, we were both finding a kind of success that couldn't be measured by promotions or paychecks, awards or accolades. It was the success of becoming fully ourselves, of defining our own worth rather than accepting the definitions imposed by others. Have you ever had a family member who consistently undermined your choices or your path in life? How did you handle it? Did you confront them or find another way to establish your boundaries? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear that they get to define their own success. Remember, healing family relationships takes time, honesty, and sometimes the courage to stand up for yourself even when it's uncomfortable. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the strength to write your own.